There's something quietly magical about the way the past whispers to us. Sometimes it speaks through the crumbling walls of an ancient city, sometimes through the faint traces of script carved into stone, and sometimes through the stillness of the night. Tonight, I want to take you far away from the hum of the modern world, to a land where mountains touch the clouds and rivers weave silver lines through the earth. A place where the air once carried the scent of frankincense, and the markets overflowed with treasures from the farthest corners of the known world. We are traveling to the Kingdom of Aksum, a civilization that rose and flourished in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea. Aksum was not just a kingdom of merchants and kings, but a bridge between worlds, Africa, Arabia, and the far reaches of Asia. It was a place where ships sailed from the Red Sea into the heart of history, and where the stones themselves seemed to hum with stories of glory and faith. But unlike the grand empires of Rome or Persia, Aksum's tale is often told in whispers. The rise of its kings, the glimmer of its gold coins, the towering stelae that reach toward the sky like frozen giants. These are fragments of a world that feels both distant and strangely close. So tonight, I invite you to close your eyes, slow your breathing, and let your mind wander back in time. Let the soft cadence of this story guide you until the outside world fades away, and all that remains is the rustle of the Ethiopian wind through the highland grass. Before we begin, I'd love to know, from where are you listening tonight? Is it morning where you are, or has the day already folded into darkness? Perhaps you are curled beneath warm blankets, the lights low, ready to drift away to the rhythm of the past. Wherever you are part of this journey now. If you could stand at the edge of the Ethiopian highlands in the early light of dawn, you would see a world shaped not just by time, but by the patient hands of earth and sky. The land of Aksum did not shout for attention. It sang softly. Rolling green hills rose into ancient mountains, their peaks lost in wisps of cloud. The morning air was cool and thin, carrying with it the scent of damp soil after the night's mist. Streams trickled through valleys, their waters feeding the terraced fields that had been carved into the hillsides for generations. Here, the earth gave generously, offering teff, barley, and wheat to those who understood how to coax life from its rich, dark depths. And yet, this was not an isolated paradise. Far beyond the ridges lay the Red Sea, a narrow, restless stretch of water that shimmered like molten silver beneath the sun. To the west stretched the vast interior of Africa, to the east, the Arabian Peninsula. The highlands of Aksum were cradled perfectly between worlds, like a jewel set into the crown of the ancient earth. It is no wonder that humans settled here so long ago. Archaeologists trace the deep roots of the Aksumite world back to prehistoric cultures, who learned to adapt to the shifting climate and use the land's natural abundance. Over centuries, small communities began to cluster into more organized societies. Their economies built on farming, cattle herding, and the exchange of goods with neighboring peoples. But geography was more than just a backdrop. It was destiny. The mountains acted as guardians, shielding the heartland from the easy reach of foreign invaders, while the Red Sea became a highway for opportunity. Even before Aksum became a kingdom, its people were learning to look outward, sending goods down dusty caravan routes toward the coast, where ships awaited to carry them to far-off lands. Standing on those mountain ridges, one could look eastward and imagine the faint outlines of Arabia across the water. And beyond that, India, with its spices and silk. Looking north, one could almost feel the distant pull of Egypt, its ancient monuments still standing tall against the desert winds. The land itself nurtured a certain resilience, a quiet strength that would define the Aksumite people. Life here demanded patience, the kind of patience it takes to build stone upon stone until a city rises, or to plant a seed and wait for the rains to come. And so, in these highlands, beneath skies that seemed eternal, the seeds of a kingdom began to grow, not in sudden bursts of conquest, but in the steady rhythm of seasons, trade, and faith. The earth was ready. The rivers sang their low song, and somewhere in the hills, the first whispers of Aksum stirred, ready to rise. But the rise of a kingdom is never a simple thing, for the path from scattered villages to a throne is a story of ambition, alliances, and the lure of faraway riches. Before Aksum became a name carved into stone and remembered by history, it was simply a patchwork of human lives spread across the highlands. Farmers, herders, traders, and craftsmen. The story of the kingdom begins not with a single ruler or battle, but with the slow weaving together of these communities into something larger than themselves. Long before royal palaces rose from the earth, the people here lived in small settlements, each built of rough stone and timber. Hugging the hillsides, narrow footpaths wound between the homes, the scent of baking bread drifting on the wind. The fields were dotted with oxen pulling wooden plows, while children played near the streams that would one day feed entire cities. These early societies were shaped by two forces, the bounty of the land and the pull of the sea. Caravans from the highlands moved toward the Red Sea ports, laden with ivory from the African interior, animal hides, gold, and aromatic resins, frankincense, and myrrh, that would later fill the temples of faraway lands. In return came beads of glass from the Levant, cloth from India, and strange spices that seemed to carry the scent of distant monsoons. There were no borders yet, no unifying banner, but there was a growing rhythm to life that connected village to village, valley to valley. This network of exchange became the first quiet heartbeat of what would become Aksum. The roots of the kingdom also drew nourishment from older cultures. Inscriptions and artifacts hint at contact with the Sabaeans from South Arabia, traders and settlers who brought with them their language, architectural ideas, and perhaps even their gods. Stone temples began to rise in certain settlements, their forms echoing the styles of Arabia, but with a distinctly local soul. It is here, in this early blend of local tradition and foreign influence, that we can sense the beginning of something ambitious. Aksum was not born in isolation. It was a child of both Africa and Arabia, molded by trade winds and mountain rains. We can imagine, perhaps, an early leader, not yet a king, but a respected elder, standing on a ridge as the sun sank low, speaking to his people of a future where the scattered communities might unite for strength and prosperity. Such visions often begin in whispers, carried on the wind, repeated around the fireside, until they no longer sound like dreams, but inevitabilities. These were the first footsteps toward kingship, shared trade, shared culture, and a growing sense of belonging to something larger. Soon, the highlands would echo with the sound of stone being quarried for monuments, coins being struck with royal images, and armies marching under a common banner. But before the crown was placed upon any head, there had to be power. And power, in those days, came from the land, the trade routes, and the will to command them. And so, the question emerges, who would be the one to take these scattered lives and forge them into a kingdom? The rise of Aksum was not the kind of tale that arrives with the clash of armies or the sudden proclamation of an empire. It was more like the slow turning of the seasons in the Highlands, a steady unfolding that transformed scattered settlements into a force recognized across seas and continents. It began in the deep folds of the Ethiopian mountains, where the earth was generous and the rains knew their rhythm. In these valleys, farmers sowed seeds into dark, fertile soil, tending to their crops with the same patience their ancestors had shown for centuries. The land repaid them with abundance. Teff, wheat, barley, and pulses that would feed not just their families, but the workers, craftsmen, and warriors who would carry the kingdom forward. Surplus was power, for it allowed leaders to feed soldiers and sustain long journeys, to reward loyalty, and to make alliances through gifts of food when gold was scarce. The mountains themselves acted as watchful guardians. Their peaks shielded the highlands from the swift invasions that troubled flatter lands. They offered vantage points from which to see an approaching enemy days before he arrived. And in the rainy season, they swelled the streams and rivers that kept the valleys alive. In this cradle, a people could grow strong without the constant fear of being swept away. But strength without ambition remains a sleeping lion. And in time, Aksum's leaders began to stir with visions that reached beyond their hills. The greatest of these visions looked eastward, toward the restless shimmer of the Red Sea. This narrow waterway was no ordinary coast. It was a living artery, pulsing with the movement of ships and goods, a meeting place for worlds. From the port of Adulis, Aksum's merchants could send their goods north to the bustling cities of Egypt and the Mediterranean, east to the incense markets of Arabia, and even farther, across the Indian Ocean to the ports of India. This was not a single path, but a web of routes, connecting markets where Greek, Egyptian, Indian, and Arabian tongues mingled in the hum of trade. The Aksumites understood something vital: control the routes, and you control the lifeblood of wealth. The goods they traded were not mere trinkets. From the African interior came ivory, gleaming and smooth, sought after by Roman craftsmen to be shaped into furniture, statues, and precious ornaments. Gold, carried in small, dense measures, found its way into the hands of those who could mint it into coins or use it to secure alliances. Exotic animal hides, leopard skins, and even live creatures, giraffes, that astonished Roman crowds, elephants destined for war or spectacle, all passed through Aksum's hands. In return came the treasures of other lands: glass beads from the Levant that shimmered like captured raindrops, fine cloth from India, spices whose aromas carried stories of distant monsoons, and iron tools that could cut or craft with equal precision. We know that by the 1st century of our era, foreign traders had already marked Aksum on their maps of the known world. The Greek text, known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, mentions Aksum as a thriving market, its name carried across waters by sailors who had never seen its highlands, but knew its wealth. This was no longer an obscure highland chiefdom. Aksum had stepped into history's light. With prosperity came the means to enforce it. Leaders who had once been little more than local chieftains became rulers in truth, commanding not just the loyalty of their immediate kin, but the obedience of distant settlements. These leaders gathered warriors, men who knew the terrain and could move swiftly through mountain passes or across dry plains to secure trade routes and punish those who defied Aksum's will. The armies were not vast in the way of Rome or Persia, but they were disciplined, and they were backed by the resources of a land rich enough to feed them. Aksum's rulers also understood the power of symbols. The first monumental stelae, tall, carved stones that would one day tower over the land, began to rise during this era. They were not merely markers of graves or commemorations. They were statements. Each one said to those who looked upon it, "Here is a people who can command the labor to shape stone, who can reach upward to the sky, who leave behind something that will endure beyond the life of any single man." Travelers arriving at Adulis or climbing into the Highlands would have seen these monuments and known they had entered a realm of significance. Yet, wealth and ambition always invite rivals. Across the Red Sea, the Himyarite kingdom in Yemen had its own designs on trade. To the north, the Nubians guarded their own routes to the Nile. At times, these neighbors were partners. At other times, they were competitors. Aksum's survival depended on more than military strength. It needed diplomacy, the ability to make treaties when war would cost too much, to offer tribute when it bought time, to forge alliances that kept enemies watching each other instead of turning their eyes toward the Highlands. Slowly, Aksum's influence stretched like a hand across the map. The fertile highlands became its heart, the Red Sea its vein, the ports its open palms ready to receive and send the world's goods. This was the shape of power in the early kingdom, a balanced combination of resource control, strategic location, and leaders who could see beyond the next harvest to the possibilities of decades ahead. By now, the people of Aksum could look around and feel the difference from the days of scattered villages. There was a sense of unity, of shared purpose. Farmers in remote valleys knew that their surplus grain might feed a soldier far from home, and traders at the coast understood that the ivory they carried was part of a chain that reached beyond any one life. Even the stories told by elders began to change, now including not only the names of ancestors, but of rulers whose authority stretched far beyond their own hills. It is in this moment, when a people begins to think not just of their family or village, but of a kingdom, that we can say Aksum truly began to rise. The climb was not yet complete. There would be higher peaks to scale, storms to endure, and rivals to outwit. But from the highland thrones, the rulers could look out over their fertile valleys and their shimmering sea, and know that they were no longer just one people among many. They were becoming a force in the world's great story, and their name was carried on the wind and the water alike. Still, for all their growing strength, there was a question that remained unanswered. How would they define the crown itself? For a kingdom to endure, it needed not only wealth and warriors, but a vision of kingship that would bind its people to their ruler in loyalty and pride. And in the centuries to come, that vision would take shape in rituals, symbols, and the awe-inspiring power of a throne that claimed its right to rule under both heaven and earth. Kingship in Aksum was not merely a matter of ruling over land and people. It was the weaving together of authority, tradition, and the sacred. To understand the heart of the Aksumite kingdom, one must picture not only the king himself, but the invisible threads that bound him to his subjects, his ancestors, and the unseen forces that were believed to guide the fate of the realm. The throne of Aksum was more than a seat of governance. It was a bridge between the mortal and the divine, between the pulse of the marketplace and the silent watch of the mountains. It is said that in the earliest days of the kingdom, the ruler was chosen not simply for his strength in battle or his skill in negotiation, but for his lineage. Bloodlines were deeply respected, for they carried the memory of generations past. To be descended from a line of leaders was to inherit not only their rights, but their responsibilities. Yet, lineage alone could not hold a kingdom together. The king had to be a figure who inspired both fear and devotion. A man who could ride at the head of his warriors, yet also stand in the sacred spaces where offerings were made to the gods. In those days before Christianity took root, Aksum's rulers were the custodians of the old beliefs. They were expected to honor the deities of their land, to ensure that the rains would come and the harvests would be plentiful, to act as the intermediary between the human world and the divine. Ceremonies were held on hilltops and in temples built of finely dressed stone, where incense rose in curling streams toward the sky. It was here that the king's authority was reinforced, not just by his own voice, but by the murmured prayers of priests and the chants of the people. Yet the throne was also a place of law and command. The king was the ultimate judge in disputes, the one who could settle matters between nobles, merchants, or farmers with a word. His authority extended over the caravan routes, the ports, the armies, and the treasury. Under his gaze, taxes were collected, not only in coin, but in goods, grain, and livestock, to feed the machinery of the kingdom. In return, he was expected to protect his people from raiders, to safeguard the trade routes, and to lead in times of war. The court of Aksum was a place of ceremony, but not one of idle luxury. Foreign envoys from Arabia, India, and even the Roman Empire may have stood before the throne, presenting gifts to secure the king's favor or negotiate trade agreements. These encounters were not merely diplomatic. They were performances, each side displaying their wealth and power through the richness of their offerings, the fineness of their attire, and the dignity of their speech. The king of Aksum, seated upon a carved wooden or stone throne, draped in garments woven from the finest local cloth, and perhaps adorned with gold, would listen, weigh, and decide. Symbols played a vital role in reinforcing his authority. Early Aksumite coins began to bear the likenesses of their rulers, a practice borrowed perhaps from the great empires with whom they traded. To hold a coin with the king's face was to carry a piece of his presence, a reminder of his reach. Inscriptions in the Giez script began to appear on monuments and stelae, recording the deeds of kings, their victories, their building projects, and their devotion to the gods. These were not meant for the common villager to read. Literacy was rare, but for posterity, and for the eyes of other rulers who might come upon them. Even the great stelae that rose above the capital were part of this language of kingship. Some marked the tombs of rulers, their massive stones carved with patterns that mimicked the architecture of royal palaces. In their silent height, they proclaimed that the king's power did not end with death. His memory, his influence, and perhaps even his spirit would stand watch over the kingdom long after his body was laid to rest. Yet kingship was never without danger. To rule over a land as strategically important as Aksum meant being constantly aware of rivals, both near and far. A weak king could see his authority crumble as nobles vied for power, or as rival leaders rose from within the Highlands to challenge his rule. To prevent such unrest, Aksumite kings often had to demonstrate their strength early in their reigns, leading military campaigns, quelling rebellions, or asserting control over key trade centers. Success in such endeavors was not only a practical necessity, but a symbolic one. It showed the people, and the nobles alike, that the king was no mere inheritor of titles, but a leader worthy of them. In the rhythm of daily governance, the king's presence would be felt even by those who never saw him in person. Farmers in distant valleys paid tribute in grain or livestock, knowing that a portion would find its way to the royal stores. Merchants at Adulis dealt with officials who acted in the king's name, ensuring that taxes on goods were paid and that the laws of the kingdom were upheld. Soldiers patrolled the roads and caravan routes, their loyalty sworn to the king. Even in absence, his hand was there, guiding and guarding. But the greatest strength of the throne lay not in force alone. It lay in the delicate balance between power and legitimacy. The sense among the people that the king's right to rule was ordained, whether by the gods of the old religion or, in time, by the Christian faith that would reshape the kingdom's soul. Without that legitimacy, even the most fearsome army could not hold the Highlands together. We can imagine the weight the king must have felt, sitting in the quiet of his palace in the evening, after the petitions had been heard and the court dismissed. Outside, the wind would whisper through the tall grasses, carrying the faint scents of the Highland night. Somewhere in the distance, a caravan would be making its way down toward Adulis, carrying goods that would enrich the kingdom. In the dark, the king might look toward the starlit peaks and think of the generations before him and of the generations yet to come. The crown was not his alone. It was a trust passed from hand to hand, from century to century. The throne of Aksum was, in truth, as much an idea as it was an object. It was the idea that a people could be united under one ruler, that their fates were bound together, and that their place in the wider world could be secured through strength, wisdom, and the favor of powers beyond mortal sight. This idea would carry Aksum to its greatest heights, shaping its wars, its monuments, its faith, and its legacy. And yet, even as kings ruled and coins were struck, as Stelae rose and ports thrived, there were other ways the kingdom spoke to the world. Through the silent, unyielding stone giants that would become the most enduring symbols of Aksum's glory. These towering monuments would watch over the land for centuries, their meaning partly lost to time, their presence impossible to ignore. They stand still, unblinking, and yet they seem alive. Tall, slender monuments of carved granite, their faces etched with patterns that imitate the facades of grand buildings. False windows, false doors, intricate designs that speak of a culture deeply aware of both symbolism and permanence. These are the Stelae of Aksum, and they are unlike anything else in the ancient world. When you first stand before them, you might feel a quiet settle over you, as though you've stumbled into the company of silent witnesses to centuries of history. They have seen kings crowned, markets swell with foreign goods, the birth of a religion, and the slow, inevitable fading of power. Yet here they remain. The origins of these monoliths are older than memory. carved from single blocks of granite, hauled somehow from quarries miles away, and then raised upright with a precision that defies explanation. They stand as a testament to the Aksumites' skill and ambition. Some lie fallen, their massive lengths cracked where they struck the earth centuries ago. Others still stand perfectly upright, their tips pointing into the blue vault of the sky. The tallest among them once reached more than 30 meters, a height that, in the days before steel and modern cranes, would have required not only immense labor, but an unshakable determination to create something that would last for generations. It is believed these steely marked royal burial sites, though their exact purpose is still debated. They may have been intended to serve as markers for the dead, guiding their spirits to the next world, or as enduring symbols of a king's power and wealth. The carvings on their surfaces, the series of decorative panels, the imitation of architectural features, suggest they were meant to resemble the great multi-story palaces of the living, rendered in stone for the dead to inhabit eternally. In this way, they were both monuments and homes, binding the realm of the living to that of the ancestors. Imagine the process: the quarrying of the stone from the rugged hills, the shaping of its massive form with bronze or iron tools, the slow, deliberate carving of each false window, each frame, each decorative panel, then the transportation, men and animals hauling the block over uneven ground, the sound of ropes creaking, the shouts of workers coordinating every move. Finally, the raising, a feat of engineering and coordination, likely using earthen ramps and wooden supports, until at last the great stone stood upright. Its weight settled into the soil as if it had always belonged there. These monuments were not only for the eyes of the living Aksumites. They were meant to be seen by visitors from faraway lands. Imagine a merchant from the Roman world, accustomed to marble columns and amphitheaters, stepping into the Aksumite capital and seeing these impossibly tall, narrow towers rising into the sky. They would have been unlike anything he had ever encountered. And in that moment, he would understand that Aksum was no mere provincial kingdom, but a place of grandeur and vision. The Stelae field in Aksum was not an isolated site. It was woven into the living fabric of the city. Around them, homes, workshops, palaces, and temples would have bustled with activity. Traders haggled over prices in the markets. Priests prepared incense for ceremonies. Children ran in the dust. And in the background, these tall stones stood unmoving, their presence reminding all who saw them of the enduring reach of the throne. Some stelae have inscriptions in the ancient Giaz script, recording the deeds of rulers or the dedication of the monument. These inscriptions were not casual notes. They were carefully chosen words meant to endure as long as the stone itself, ensuring that the memory of the ruler would outlast his reign. In a way, they were both history and prophecy, a record of what had been done, and a silent claim to the future. Even in their silence, The Stelae spoke of the resources Aksum could command. To create such monuments required not only labor, but organization. The ability to feed and house workers, to coordinate skilled artisans, to mobilize transport, and to dedicate months, perhaps years, to a single project. It was the same skill set required to run an empire. The coordination of people and resources toward a single, lasting goal. But there is something else here, something less tangible, standing before these stones. One senses that they were meant to evoke a connection between the earth and the sky. Their long, vertical lines draw the eye upward, as if inviting the viewer to contemplate not only the power of the king, but the greater order of the cosmos. Perhaps in raising these stones, the Aksumites sought to align themselves with that order, to place their kingdom in harmony with forces beyond the reach of human hands. And yet, for all their grandeur, time has had its way with them. Many lie broken, their carved faces weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Their original colors, if they were ever painted, have long since faded. The city they once guarded has changed beyond recognition, but in their survival, they have achieved a kind of victory. Kingdoms have risen and fallen, faiths have come and gone, but the Stelae still stand, refusing to be forgotten. It is tempting to see them as solitary, but they were never truly alone. They were part of a network of symbols and structures, coins, palaces, inscriptions, that together proclaimed the strength and permanence of Aksum's kings. And while the Stelae spoke through stone, the kingdom's voice carried also through the waters of the Red Sea. In the hum of trade that connected Aksum to worlds far beyond its highlands, it was through that web of exchange, the movement of ivory, gold, incense, and silk, that Aksum's influence reached across continents. The same roads that brought materials to build the Stelae also carried goods to the ports, where ships waited to carry them to Egypt, Arabia, and India. The stones were silent, but the ports were alive with voices. And in the interplay between those two realms, the stillness of stone and the motion of trade, Aksum found its balance. Yet as the kingdom grew richer from these connections, it also became more entangled in the affairs of distant powers. Trade was never just about goods. It was about alliances, rivalries, and the constant shifting of influence. To control trade was to hold power, but it also meant attracting the attention of those who wished to take it. And so, even as the Stelae stood unmoved, the waters of the Red Sea churned with the ambitions of many. In the end, the Stelae are perhaps the purest symbol of Aksum's spirit, rooted deeply in its own soil, yet reaching outward, toward a horizon that stretched far beyond the highland hills. They remind us that Aksum's greatness was built not only on what it traded or conquered, but on what it chose to create, works meant to endure, to speak across centuries, even if their exact words have been lost to time. And so, among these silent giants, the kingdom thrived. But it was on the open water, along the winding trade routes that led from the highlands to the sea, that Aksum's heart beat fastest. For there, in the constant movement of ships and caravans, the kingdom's lifeblood flowed, a network that carried not only goods, but the very identity of Aksum into the wider world. The hum of Aksum was not found only in its markets or its royal courts. It pulsed along the roads that wound through the highlands, in the dust that rose from the feet of camels and donkeys, and in the salt-stiff breezes that rolled in from the Red Sea. Trade was not simply an aspect of life here. It was the kingdom's heartbeat, a rhythm that connected farmers in the most remote valleys to the harbors of distant continents. The web of exchange that Aksum built was vast, complex, and alive with both opportunity and danger. From the capital, routes unfurled in every direction. Some ran northward, descending toward the Sudanese plains and the Nile Valley, where contacts with Nubia could be fostered or tested. Others led eastward to Adulis, the great port city, perched on the edge of the Red Sea. To the south and west stretched paths into the African interior, where traders ventured in search of the treasures that would bring foreign merchants to Aksum's gates. These were not simple trails, they were arteries, carrying goods, people, news, and even ideas. Ivory was the most prized of these goods, smooth and pale, gleaming under the hands of craftsmen in faraway lands. A single tusk could be worth months of labor to those who transported it. And in the markets of Rome, Alexandria, or Byzantium, it would be transformed into fine inlays, statues, and ornaments for the wealthy. Alongside ivory came gold, carried in small quantities, but of immense value, mined in the Nubian deserts, or traded from further inland. Then there were the aromatic resins, frankincense, and myrrh that had long been treasured for their scent and their role in religious rites. Their fragrance was as much a part of the ancient world's commerce as grain or wine. From the interior of Africa came hides and furs, leopard skins that spoke of the wild landscapes from which they had been taken. Live animals, too, were among Aksum's exports, giraffes that would astonish the courts of distant kings, lions to be kept as symbols of strength, even elephants, whether for warfare or spectacle. Each creature carried with it not only value, but the wonder of its origins, a living proof of Africa's richness. In return, ships and caravans brought to Aksum the goods of far-off worlds. From India came fine cotton textiles, dyed in vibrant colors, as well as spices, pepper, cinnamon, and cardamom, that could transform a meal or a medicine. From the Eastern Mediterranean and the Roman world came glassware, worked into delicate shapes, and wines sealed in amphorae. Iron tools, weapons, and luxury items arrived from various ports, along with beads that shimmered like captured drops of the sea. The port of Adulis was the kingdom's window to all this. Imagine it in its prime, ships with billowing sails riding the tide into harbor, their hulls creaking under the weight of cargo. Sailors calling to one another in a mix of languages: Greek, Ge'ez, Arabic, and tongues from further east. The markets along the waterfront crowded with stalls, where goods were weighed, measured, and haggled over, the air rich with the scents of spice and sea salt. Officials moved among the crowd, keeping records, collecting duties, ensuring that the king's share was not forgotten. The Red Sea itself was both opportunity and challenge. Its narrow waters connected the Mediterranean world with the Indian Ocean, but they also required careful navigation. Seasonal winds, the monsoons, dictated the movement of ships. A sailor who knew when to catch them could travel swiftly between Adulis and the ports of Arabia or India. Those who misjudged could find themselves stranded for months. Pirates, too, lurked along the coasts, ready to take advantage of any vessel that sailed without adequate protection. Aksum's mastery of these waters was not accidental. The kingdom maintained not only merchant vessels, but also the means to protect them. Its influence extended to coastal settlements, ensuring that key points along the shore could be relied upon for shelter and resupply. At times, Aksumite fleets and armies would cross the Red Sea itself, asserting dominance over Arabian ports and ensuring that no rival could easily choke its trade. Control of trade routes also meant influence in politics far beyond Aksum's borders. The Roman Empire valued the goods that came from and through Aksum, and Byzantine emperors would later court the kingdom's favor. Likewise, Aksum's connections with Indian merchants created links that were as much cultural as commercial. Ideas traveled along these same routes: religious beliefs, artistic styles, even elements of language. The Red Sea was not only a corridor for goods, it was a meeting place for worlds. It is easy to imagine an Aksumite trader who began his journey in the capital, leading a caravan down to Adulis, where he would watch his goods loaded onto a ship bound for Arabia. Weeks later, he might follow them across the sea, standing on the deck as the coastline faded, feeling the shift of the wind and the salt spray on his face. He might return months later with fabrics from India, wine from the Mediterranean, and news from far-off lands, news that would be shared in the markets and perhaps even in the royal court. This constant movement fed not only Aksum's economy, but its identity. The kingdom saw itself not as a remote highland power, but as a central player in a vast network that tied together Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Its rulers could look at the goods in their treasuries: gold coins from Rome, silks from the East, and see proof that their reach extended far beyond the mountains. But the web of trade was a delicate thing. A shift in the monsoon winds, a conflict in a distant port, or the rise of a rival power could all send ripples that reached Aksum's shores. This was a truth the kingdom understood well, and it would one day face the consequences when these routes changed. For now, however, the currents of fortune ran in Aksum's favor, and its merchants and rulers alike grew rich on the flow of goods and the connections they brought. And yet, amid the wealth and the goods, something else was being carried along these routes, something invisible, but far more transformative. Faiths and beliefs traveled alongside the spices and the gold, carried by merchants, sailors, and missionaries. In time, one faith in particular would cross the waters and take root in the Highlands, reshaping the kingdom's soul and its legacy forever. Long before the kingdoms, rulers proclaimed allegiance to Christianity. The people of Aksum moved in a world woven through with gods, spirits, and ancestral powers. Their faith was not kept in the pages of a book, but in the weight of stone altars, the smoke of incense curling into the morning air, and the silent presence of sacred places known only to those who lived among the high hills. It was a religion that spoke in symbols, in the rhythm of offerings, and in the balance between the seen and unseen. The Aksumites worshipped a pantheon that drew from both their African roots and the influences of the Arabian Peninsula. Chief among their deities was Maram, often considered the god of war and the divine protector of the king himself. In inscriptions, Maram is described as a mighty figure, one who granted victory in battle, and who shared a special, almost familial bond with the ruler. The king was said to be the son of Maram, ruling with the god's blessing. To defy the king was, in a sense, to defy Maram. Alongside Maram stood other deities, such as Behur, associated with the sea and waters, perhaps reflecting the kingdom's deep ties to the Red Sea trade routes. There was also Habas, linked to agriculture and fertility, whose favor was sought to ensure the harvest. And then there were gods whose origins are more mysterious to us now, their names carved into ancient inscriptions, but their stories lost to time. Worship often centered around monumental stone structures, altars, and stelae, where sacrifices were made. In some cases, these sacrifices were offerings of animals, their blood spilled to honor the gods and secure their favor. Incense burned constantly in these sacred spaces, not only as a gift to the divine, but as a way of carrying prayers upward, the sweet smoke acting as a bridge between earth and heaven. Aksumite religion was deeply bound to the cycles of nature. Festivals marked the turning of seasons, the sowing of fields, and the gathering of crops. Priests played a vital role in these events, acting as intermediaries between the people and the gods. They kept the rituals, guarded sacred knowledge, and interpreted omens, a bird's flight, a sudden change in the wind, the behavior of animals. For in the old faith, nothing was accidental. All events were part of a larger pattern shaped by divine will. The influence of South Arabian culture is clear in many of these practices. The early kings of Aksum even inscribed their victories in a script derived from Sabaean writing, and some of the temples bore architectural features reminiscent of those found across the Red Sea. This was not surprising. The currents of the Red Sea carried not just goods, but beliefs, stories, and sacred traditions. Over time, these influences blended with local customs to create something distinctly Aksumite. There was no sharp divide between religion and governance in this world. The king's authority was partly rooted in his role as the chief religious figure of the land. He was the one who led major sacrifices, the one who called upon Marum for victory, the one who ensured that the gods received their due in times of plenty and in times of need. If the rains failed or a defeat occurred, it was not just a political crisis. It was a spiritual one. The people would look to the king, wondering whether he had somehow lost the favor of the gods. In the capital, religious life was a daily presence. Temples rose near the palace, their courtyards alive with the movement of worshippers. Pilgrims would travel from the countryside to offer their gifts, a portion of their harvest, the finest of their livestock, precious incense, gathered from distant groves. Stone inscriptions recorded the fulfillment of vows, promises made to the gods in times of trouble, and later kept when fortune turned. One can imagine the atmosphere on a festival day. The city's streets would be lined with spectators as processions carried images or symbols of the gods through the heart of Aksum. Priests in ceremonial dress led chants. Drums and horns echoed off the stone walls, and the air was thick with the scent of burning myrrh. Offerings would be piled high, the abundance itself a declaration of the kingdom's prosperity and devotion. But as open as Aksum was to influences from across the sea, the old faith carried its own depth of meaning, rooted in the land. Sacred groves, mountain peaks, and springs were imbued with spiritual significance. Some were believed to be dwelling places of the gods, others gateways between the human world and realms beyond. These sites often lay far from the capital, accessible only to those who knew the paths. In such places, a farmer or herder might make a private offering, far from the grand temples, but no less sincere in the eyes of the divine. It was into this religious landscape that foreign faiths began to seep, carried by traders and travelers. Judaism and Christianity were already present in neighboring lands, and merchants from those traditions passed through Aksum's ports. Their stories, their holy books, and their distinct ways of worship must have seemed both familiar and strange to the Aksumites. Familiar in their devotion to a higher power, strange in their rejection of the many gods. And yet, the old faith was resilient. For centuries, it had guided the people's understanding of life, death, and the cosmos. It was tied to the legitimacy of kings, to the rhythms of trade, and to the turning of the seasons. To abandon it would mean reshaping the very foundations of the kingdom's identity. But history has a way of turning when no one expects it. In time, the old gods of Aksum would find themselves standing beside a new symbol, the cross, and the balance of power between them would begin to shift. It would not happen in an instant, nor without tension. But once begun, the transformation would be irreversible. For in the reign of one king, a decision would be made that would bind Aksum to a new faith, aligning it with distant empires and altering the course of its story for all time. It is in the mid-4th century of our era, and the kingdom stands at a point of both confidence and vulnerability. Trade flows through its ports. The king's banners wave over distant lands, and the old gods still receive their sacrifices. Yet beyond the mountains, in lands tied to Aksum by commerce and diplomacy, another faith grows, a faith with one God, one book, and a vision of salvation that stretches beyond any single kingdom. This is the world into which King Ezana rises to power. When Ezana first ascended the throne, he did so as the son of Maram, heir to a long tradition of rulers bound to the old gods. In the early inscriptions of his reign, the language is still filled with the invocations to the war god, still steeped in the polytheistic rites that had legitimized Aksumite kings for generations. He led campaigns into neighboring territories, asserting dominance, protecting trade, and fulfilling the image of a warrior king. But somewhere along the road, perhaps in the palace, perhaps in the quiet counsel of a trusted teacher, Ezana's heart began to turn toward something new. That teacher was Frumentius, a Syrian Christian who had arrived in Aksum years earlier under extraordinary circumstances. According to tradition, Frumentius had been shipwrecked on the Red Sea coast as a boy, captured, and brought to the Aksumite court. There, his intelligence and adaptability brought him into royal service. Over time, he gained the trust of the Queen Regent and eventually of Ezana himself. Frumentius was no mere servant. He was a believer, in subtle ways at first, and later more openly. He spoke to Ezana of the teachings of Christ, of a God who ruled heaven and earth, of a faith that was spreading from Jerusalem to Rome and beyond, of a salvation that was not bound to tribe or empire, but open to all. Perhaps Ezana saw in this a faith that could unify his diverse kingdom, stretching from the highlands to the coasts, across languages and peoples. Perhaps he felt the weight of shifting alliances, recognizing that the Christian Byzantine Empire could be a powerful friend in an uncertain world. Or perhaps it was something more personal, a conviction stirred deep within him. What we know is that the change came, and it came decisively. At some point in his reign, Ezana abandoned the old titles of son of Maram and began inscribing his victories and decrees in the name of the Lord of Heaven. The sacrifices to the gods gave way to the sign of the cross. Coins that had once carried the crescent and disc symbols of the old faith now bore the cross, proclaiming to every trader who handled them that the kingdom had a new spiritual anchor. The conversion of a king was not merely a private matter. In a land where royal authority and religion were bound together, Ezana's baptism signaled a shift for the entire kingdom. Churches began to rise, at first likely built in styles familiar from other lands, but soon taking on forms suited to the Aksumite landscape. Priests were appointed, and the scriptures began to be translated into Ge'ez, the language of the kingdom. Frumentius himself traveled to Alexandria to seek the support of the patriarch, returning as the first bishop of Aksum. Yet such a transformation could not have been without resistance. The old priesthoods, the guardians of Maram's altars, would have seen their influence wane. The people, long accustomed to festivals and sacrifices tied to the rhythms of the land, had to adjust to new rites, new symbols, and a new understanding of the divine. Change came more quickly in the cities and at the court than in the remote highlands, where the old gods lingered in the quiet of sacred groves and mountain springs. For Ezana, the embrace of Christianity brought more than spiritual change. It opened new diplomatic horizons. Aksum could now stand as a Christian power in the Red Sea, a partner to Byzantium in both trade and faith. This alliance was not merely symbolic. It carried the weight of shared identity in an age where religion was deeply entwined with politics. Still, the king's new faith did not erase his role as a ruler in the old sense. He continued to lead military campaigns, to guard trade routes, and to administer justice. But now these actions were framed in a different light, as the duties of a Christian monarch, acting under the authority of the one God. Victories were no longer credited to Maram, but to the Lord of Heaven, who helped me in battle. One can imagine the scene, a great ceremony in the capital, the king emerging before his people, bearing not the symbols of the war god, but the cross. Priests chant in Ge'ez, their voices rising above the crowd. The incense still burns, but now as an offering to the Christian God. The people watch, some with devotion, some with uncertainty, all aware that something irreversible has occurred. Ezana's choice would echo far beyond his lifetime. Christianity would sink deep roots in Aksum, shaping its art, its architecture, and its identity. In time, the kingdom would become a beacon of the faith in Africa, guarding its traditions through centuries of change. But at the moment of Ezana's reign, the path forward was still untested, and the fusion of the new faith with the old traditions was a delicate process. And yet, faith has a way of intertwining with destiny. In the years to come, Aksum's Christianity would not only define its place in the world, it would also drive it into conflicts and alliances that would test the kingdom's strength, even as its wealth and influence reached their height. The kingdom now stood in full bloom. Its highland capital gleamed with stone palaces and towering Stelae. Its markets rang with the calls of traders speaking in many tongues, and its ports along the Red Sea bustled with ships heavy with goods. Christianity had taken root in the court, giving Aksum a new identity in the eyes of the world. But it was trade, steady, tireless, and far-reaching, that fed the kingdom's wealth and influence. From the highlands came gold, ivory, frankincense, and myrrh, goods sought after in every great market of the ancient world. From beyond, the borders came silk from China, spices from India, wine from the Mediterranean, and glassware from the Near East. The port of Adulis, sitting like a jewel on the Red Sea coast, was the gateway through which these riches flowed. The sea was both highway and theater. Aksum's ships were built strong enough to ride the seasonal monsoon winds that carried them south to the coasts of India and back again. In Adulis, the scene was one of constant motion. Dockworkers unloading fragrant sacks of cinnamon, long-necked amphorae of wine, and bundles of bright silk. Scribes keeping careful records for the king's treasury, merchants bargaining in the shade of warehouses, their eyes always scanning for the next opportunity. It was not only goods that moved here. Ideas, technologies, and beliefs traveled with every crew and caravan. Stories from far-off lands found their way into the conversations of Aksum's citizens. Tales of Roman emperors, Indian dynasties, and strange beasts from unknown continents. In the bustling quarters of Adulis, one could hear Ge'ez, Greek, Latin, and the languages of Arabia and the Indian Ocean islands, all blending into a chorus of trade. The capital itself reflected this prosperity. The great stone stelae, some rising over 30 meters into the sky, had long been symbols of royal power, their carved facades imitating the architecture of multi-storied palaces. Though many were erected before the Christian era, they remained visible reminders of the kingdom's strength and heritage. Around them, new churches began to rise, often built on ancient foundations, blending the old stonework with the new faith symbols. In the Golden Age, Aksum's kings were not merely rulers of a territory. They were custodians of an empire of trade. Control of the Red Sea lanes was vital, and Aksum wielded both diplomacy and force to maintain it. When rival powers threatened its interests, be they Arabian tribes, Persian merchants, or restless vassals, the kingdom acted decisively. One of the clearest records we have of Aksum's reach comes from a traveler named Cosmas Indicoplousts, a Byzantine merchant turned monk who visited in the 6th century. He wrote of a kingdom powerful enough to command the respect of the Romans, and of a ruler whose word carried weight across the seas. In his account, Aksum was counted among the 4 great powers of the known world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. An extraordinary acknowledgement for a kingdom rooted in the African highlands. We must imagine the pride of its people at this time. Farmers bringing their goods to market would have seen coins stamped with the cross, knowing these same coins might end up in distant lands. Sailors would return from months-long voyages with stories of foreign shores, their ships laden with treasure. Diplomats would arrive in the capital bearing gifts and messages from faraway rulers, and yet this age of splendor was not without its tensions. The very roots that brought wealth also brought rivalry. The Persian Empire sought influence over the same seas. Arabian tribes shifted alliances, sometimes trading, sometimes raiding. Even the great Byzantine allies had their own interests, which did not always align with Aksum's. Still, in these years, the kingdom seemed invincible. Its Christian faith gave it a spiritual anchor, its trade gave it wealth, its military power gave it security. The name Aksum was spoken with a mixture of respect and ambition in the halls of foreign rulers, but history is never still. Just as the monsoon winds shift, so too do the currents of fortune. The same seas that carried Aksum's ships to India could one day carry rival fleets. The same alliances that brought strength could turn cold, and in the distance, far beyond the horizon of the Red Sea, new powers were beginning to stir. For now, though, the kingdom basked in the fullness of its glory. In the cool evenings of the Highland capital, the king might walk among the Stelae, hearing the prayers rising from the new churches, knowing that his banners flew over lands rich and far-reaching. He could not have known that storms lay ahead, storms that would come not only from the sea, but from deep within the currents of history itself. The Red Sea was more than a lifeline for Aksum. It was a mirror. Across its waters lay the rugged coastlines of Arabia, home to tribes, trading towns, and kingdoms whose fortunes, like Aksum's, rose and fell with the tides of commerce. For centuries, the people of Aksum had dealt with these neighbors as partners, rivals, and occasionally enemies. But in the 6th century, a series of events would draw the kingdom into a conflict that would carry its banners far from home. The spark came from religion, though beneath it lay the deeper currents of trade and politics. Across the sea, in the Arabian kingdom of Himyar, Christianity had begun to take root, aided by ties to Aksum and Byzantium. But Himyar was not united in faith. In the early 500s, its ruler adopted Judaism as the state religion, and tension with the Christian population grew. That tension erupted into open persecution. The city of Nadran became the scene of a massacre, its Christian inhabitants killed for refusing to renounce their faith. News of the slaughter traveled swiftly. In Constantinople, the Christian Byzantine emperor was outraged, but it was Aksum, closer and already tied by faith to the victims, that was best placed to act. King Caleb of Aksum, ruling in the tradition of Ezana's Christian kingship, saw both a moral and strategic cause. Defending fellow Christians was not only a duty of faith, it was an opportunity to strengthen Aksum's influence across the sea. The decision was made. Ships were prepared in the ports of Adulis and Massawa, their hulls stocked with provisions, their decks fitted for warriors. The journey across the Red Sea was not long, but it was treacherous. Unpredictable winds, sudden squalls, and rocky shoals claimed more than one vessel over the centuries. Yet the fleet sailed, driven by the twin winds of religious conviction and royal ambition. When the Aksumite army landed on Arabian soil, it was more than a military campaign. It was a statement. The war that followed was swift and decisive. Caleb's forces overthrew the Himyarite ruler responsible for the massacre, replacing him with a Christian vassal, king loyal to Aksum. Churches were restored, and for a time, the Red Sea's southern shores answered to Aksum's authority. It was a high point of the kingdom's international reach. Now, Aksum stood as the undisputed Christian power of the southern Red Sea, with influence stretching into the Arabian Peninsula. Trade routes on both sides of the water were under its watch, and its ships could sail without fear of hostile ports. But power, once gained, must be maintained, and here began the strain. Governing a distant territory across a narrow but treacherous sea proved costly. Local politics in Arabia were turbulent, with tribal alliances shifting as quickly as the desert winds. Aksumite garrisons were needed to keep order, and these required supplies from home. Every caravan of grain, every replacement of troops, drew on the kingdom's resources. Worse still, the campaign entangled Aksum in the growing rivalry between Byzantium and Persia. The Persians, seeking to counter Byzantine influence, began to court allies in Arabia, undermining Aksum's position. The Red Sea became not only a highway of trade, but a chessboard of imperial competition. Over time, the cost of holding Arabian territory began to outweigh the benefits. Revolts flared, some driven by religious tensions, others by resistance to foreign rule. In one of the most dramatic turns, the Aksumite viceroy in Arabia, Abraha, broke from Caleb's authority and established his own rule, still Christian, but no longer obedient to the capital. Though Aksum retained influence, the dream of a stable, loyal Christian kingdom across the sea faded. By the later 6th century, Persian forces had moved into Arabia, and Aksum's foothold there was lost. The campaign that had once seemed a triumph now stood as the beginning of a slow shift in fortunes. Yet, in those days, while the memory was fresh, the Arabian expedition was still a source of pride. Songs were sung of King Caleb's piety and courage, of the ships sailing under the cross, of the enemies cast down, and the faithful restored. The old Stelae in the capital were joined by inscriptions recording the victory, linking Aksum's name forever to the defense of its faith. And perhaps, in the quiet hours, Caleb himself reflected on the price of such glory: the silver spent, the lives lost, the long shadow it cast over the kingdom's treasury and strength. For history often hides its turning points in the midst of celebration, and the line between triumph and overreach is thin indeed. Across the sea, in the hills of Aksum, life still went on much as it had. Farmers tended their fields, merchants prepared their caravans, priests led their congregations in prayer. But somewhere beneath the hum of prosperity, a note of strain had begun to sound, a reminder that even the mightiest kingdom cannot hold every shore forever. In the golden light of the highland mornings, Aksum still looked unshaken. The Stelae still rose against the sky, coins still clinked in the markets, and the Red Sea ports still sent forth their sails. But beneath this familiar rhythm, the kingdom was entering a period of subtle erosion. It is in times such as these, when everything appears well, that the most enduring changes often take root. Part of the strain came from far beyond Aksum's borders. The ancient web of trade upon which the kingdom thrived was beginning to reweave itself in unfamiliar patterns. New powers were emerging along the Arabian coast, especially in the wake of Aksum's retreat from Himyar. Persian influence was now firmly established there, and with it came a shift in Red Sea politics. Routes that had once been reliably open to Aksumite merchants were now contested or taxed in new ways. Farther still, to the east, changes in Indian Ocean trade meant that ships increasingly bypassed the Red Sea altogether, favoring overland connections through Persia or the Gulf. This was a slow turn of the compass, not a sudden break. But in a kingdom where commerce was as much the lifeblood as rain to the crops, even small diversions in the flow of goods carried weight. Closer to home, the cost of sustaining Aksum's height had left its mark. Years of overseas campaigns and the maintenance of a powerful army had drained resources. While the highlands remained fertile, climate patterns began to show signs of shift. Archaeological evidence suggests that this period may have seen episodes of drought or irregular rainfall, conditions that made harvests less predictable. For a kingdom whose strength rested partly on feeding its people and its armies, such uncertainty was no small matter. Yet, perhaps, the most insidious pressures were those that could not be measured in silver or grain, the changes in the fabric of loyalty, in the balance between central authority and local power. Aksum's strength had always rested on its ability to unite diverse peoples under one crown, from highland farmers to coastal traders and caravan guides. But as trade routes faltered and the reach of the royal court was tested, local rulers and governors began to operate with greater independence. The Christian faith, once a unifying force, also became a point of delicate balance. While it had bound the kingdom closer to Byzantium and linked its identity to a universal cause, it had also altered old traditions. In the countryside, older beliefs lingered, blending with Christian practice in ways that sometimes troubled the clergy. These differences were not open rebellions, at least not yet, but they hinted at a quiet drift between the heart of the kingdom and its farthest edges. The ports, too, were changing in character. Adulis still saw ships from distant lands, but their numbers were fewer, and the goods they carried were not always as rich as before. Some merchants, seeking new fortunes, chose to settle elsewhere along the coasts of Arabia or East Africa, where opportunities seemed fresher. The hum of the market was still there, but it no longer had the same crowded, electric energy of Aksum's brightest days. If a traveler walked the streets of the capital in this time, they might not have noticed anything amiss. The palaces still gleamed, the priests still chanted, The market still sold silks, spices, and gold, yet in the quiet conversations of merchants over cups of spiced wine, or in the guarded words of court advisors, there were hints of unease. The kingdom was still grand, but it was no longer growing, and in the ancient world, to stop growing was to begin, however slowly, to yield. There were still moments of pride and strength in these years. Diplomatic visits from distant rulers, victories over local uprisings, and new church constructions that spoke of devotion and confidence. But the undercurrents were shifting. Aksum was no longer the undisputed master of the southern Red Sea. Its rivals had grown bolder, and its alliances were less certain. It is tempting to imagine that the people of Aksum did not notice this change, that they lived unaware of the slow decline. But people know, in ways beyond words, when the seasons are turning. They may not predict the storm, but they can feel the change in the air. Aksum's farmers still sowed their fields, but perhaps with a little more caution. Merchants still set sail, but perhaps with more prayer for safe passage. And the king still sat upon his throne, though perhaps his eyes lingered longer on the horizon. For now, the kingdom endured a highland jewel with a deep history and a faith that gave it strength. But just beyond the mountains and the sea, a tide was gathering. It would come not as a single wave, but as a slow and rising flood, reshaping everything it touched. It began, as so many great changes do, far from the Aksumite heartland, across the Red Sea, in the rugged lands of the Arabian Peninsula. A new faith was being spoken aloud in the streets of Mecca. Its message was at once familiar and radical. The call to worship one God alone, to live in justice, to see all believers as brothers and sisters. At first, this faith, Islam, was embraced by only a small group of followers, many of whom found themselves in conflict with the powerful merchant clans of their city. Persecution followed, and in the year 615, a small band of these early Muslims sought refuge across the water. Their leader, the Prophet Muhammad, sent them not north to Byzantium, nor deeper into the desert, but to the Christian kingdom of Aksum. He had heard of its ruler, the Negus, as a man of fairness and mercy. In this decision lay one of the most remarkable moments in Aksumite history, the meeting of two great faiths in an act of trust. The refugees arrived at the Aksumite court, weary from travel and carrying little but their faith. There, before the Negus, they explained who they were, what they believed, and why they had fled. Their words stirred the court, and when hostile envoys from Mecca demanded their return, the Negus refused. He granted them safety and allowed them to remain in his lands. It is said that the Negus and his court wept when passages from the Quran describing Jesus and Mary were recited, finding in them a kinship with their own beliefs. In that moment, politics gave way to something deeper, the recognition that truth, however spoken, can cross the boundaries of kingdoms. This gesture of protection would be remembered in Islamic tradition for centuries. Yet at the same time, the larger currents of history were moving in ways that would test Aksum's strength. As Islam spread beyond Arabia, it began to reshape the Red Sea world. Ports along the Arabian coast became part of an emerging Muslim network of trade and faith, and the balance of power in the region shifted again. For Aksum, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, long-standing rivalries with Arabian powers gave way to a new reality. Many of the ports and routes that had once been contested were now firmly in Muslim hands. On the other hand, the early goodwill between the Prophet's followers and the Aksumite crown meant that the kingdom was spared the kind of hostility that might have crushed it outright. There were no great invasions from across the sea, no burning of its ports, at least, not yet. But trade is a silent measure of power, and here the changes were unmistakable. Muslim merchants, with their growing influence across the Indian Ocean, began to dominate the commerce that had once flowed naturally through Aksum. Goods that might have passed through Adulis were increasingly carried by Muslim fleets along routes that bypassed the kingdom. The flow of wealth into the Highlands slowed. Meanwhile, inland pressures grew. Shifting climate patterns continued to trouble harvests. Some scholars suggest that soil exhaustion in parts of the Highlands made farming less productive, forcing people to move or adapt in ways that disrupted the old patterns of life. Local leaders became more autonomous, less dependent on the central court. The ties that had once bound the kingdom tightly began to loosen. And yet, the memory of the Negus' mercy toward the Muslim refugees remained a quiet shield, even as Muslim power expanded along the coasts and into the interior of Africa. Aksum was not targeted for destruction. Instead, it was gradually sidelined. Its prominence in the Red Sea trade replaced by new centers along the Arabian and African shores. One can imagine the view from the highland capital in those days. The hills still green in the rainy season, the air still carrying the scent of incense from church ceremonies, the Stelae still standing tall. To the casual eye, little had changed, but to those who dealt in silver and spice, in ships and ports, the world was different. The pulse of commerce had shifted away, and with it, the heartbeat of the kingdom grew slower. Still, there was dignity in how Aksum faced this new world. It did not vanish in war, nor crumble in sudden ruin. Instead, it endured smaller in reach, quieter in voice, but still a keeper of its faith and traditions. The gesture of welcome to strangers in need had earned it a kind of moral stature that no loss of trade could erase. Yet history is rarely kind to those who are slowly eclipsed. Beyond the mountains, along the coasts, new powers were rising, and the roads that once led to Aksum's markets grew overgrown. The kingdom's story was far from over, but the age of easy dominance had passed. And in the silence after the caravan bells, a new question began to stir. How does a great kingdom live on when its glory no longer rests on wealth and conquest? Then let us walk with quiet steps into the later years, when the echoes of Aksum's greatness still lingered in stone and memory. But the life of the kingdom was slowly flowing elsewhere, as rivers shift their course over long centuries. This was not the crash of a falling empire, but the slow, almost imperceptible drift of a crown from one place to another, as though the wind itself had turned. The city of Aksum, for centuries the heartbeat of the kingdom, still wore its old grandeur with a certain grace. Its stelae rose against the horizon, casting long shadows across the highland fields. Churches still stood where the kings of old had knelt in prayer. Pilgrims still climbed the paths to its gates, their voices low in reverence. But within its walls, the great hum of commerce had faded to something gentler. Markets still opened, but the goods were fewer, the faces more familiar than foreign. The sailors who once crowded Adulis with news from distant ports now came less often, and when they did, their journeys led them on toward other destinations. Trade, which had been the lifeblood of Aksum's rise, had largely rerouted itself. The Red Sea lanes were in new hands, dominated by Muslim fleets and ports that no longer depended on Aksum's highland routes. Inland, shifting political patterns made it more difficult to maintain the old networks. Smaller kingdoms and local chiefs held sway over the roads that once answered directly to the Negus, and tribute from those lands came less reliably than before. It is in such times, when the outer world grows more distant, that kingdoms often turn inward. Aksum's rulers, perhaps by choice, perhaps by necessity, began to focus less on the far reaches of their realm and more on the lands closest to their power. This may be why the court eventually drifted southward, away from the old capital, toward the region we now know as the interior highlands of Ethiopia. There, in lands greener and perhaps less threatened by outside influence, the kings could still rule securely. We do not know the exact moment when Aksum ceased to be the capital in more than name. It likely happened without ceremony, without any proclamation that the throne had moved. The transition was probably gradual, a matter of practical governance. The royal court would spend more time in the new centers, building new churches, issuing decrees from fresh halls, until one day, Aksum's role was more symbolic than administrative. The people, however, did not forget. The city remained a holy place, the burial ground of kings, the keeper of ancient relics. Legends, already old by then, continued to draw the faithful stories of the Ark of the Covenant resting within its walls, of Queen Maechta's journey to Jerusalem, of Solomon's bloodline ruling the Highlands. Aksum became, in a sense, less a capital and more a shrine, a place where the past was not simply remembered, but lived as part of the present. Meanwhile, the southward shift did not mean the kingdom had vanished. On the contrary, it adapted. New centers of power took up the mantle, building on the Christian faith and administrative traditions that Aksum had forged. The language, the coinage, even the sense of divine kingship endured. The crown still traced its legitimacy back to the ancient city and the Stelae that watched over its fields. But the move had consequences. By leaving the northern highlands, the kingdom reduced its direct control over the Red Sea corridor. The port of Adulis, once the jewel of Aksum's maritime trade, fell out of the royal grasp and into the influence of new powers. The sea, which had once carried the kingdom's name to Rome, India, and beyond, was now a highway for others. And yet, perhaps there was a quiet wisdom in this withdrawal. By retreating from the fray of Red Sea politics, the kingdom avoided some of the destructive conflicts that might have come with trying to reclaim its old dominance. It chose instead to survive, to transform, and to preserve its faith and culture in a changing world. If we stood in Aksum during this time, we might feel a sense of stillness, not the stillness of death, but of a place settling into a new role. The laughter of children would still echo through the narrow streets. Farmers would still bring grain to market. Priests would still carry incense into the dim light of churches. And above it all, the Stelae would stand, as they had for centuries, bearing silent witness to the passing of one age into another. But beyond the hills, the world was moving on. Arab dhows filled with spices and silk sailed routes that no longer touched the Aksumite shore. Inland, new kingdoms began to shape the political map. Aksum's name would remain, but in whispers now, in the prayers of pilgrims and the records of priests. Its light had not gone out, but it was no longer the beacon it had once been. And yet, even in this reduced role, the kingdom carried something no tide of history could wash away. A memory, a lineage, and a claim to a past that reached back into the oldest stones of the Highlands. The question that now lingered was not whether Aksum could hold its empire. That time had passed. But whether it could keep its soul intact through the centuries to come. Then let us move forward into the long twilight of Aksum's political power. A time when its armies no longer marched to foreign ports, when the sound of coins being struck for far-off markets had faded. Yet the name of Aksum still held a certain weight, not in the courts of kings abroad, but in the hearts of the faithful who lived beneath its ancient hills. By now, the Red Sea world had been thoroughly reshaped. The rise of Islamic caliphates had woven new lines of trade that curved away from the highlands, linking Arabia, Persia, India, and East Africa in networks that no longer depended on the port of Adulis. The sea lanes belonged to others, and with them went the gold and ivory, the pepper and silk, the steady flow of foreign ships that had once kept Aksum's markets humming. Yet the kingdom did not fall to invasion or burn in conquest. It simply receded, like a shoreline under a slow tide. With the court established farther south, the northern highlands became more a sacred memory than a seat of rule. Aksum itself transformed into a city of relics and legends. Pilgrims still came from across the Ethiopian plateau, and even from lands beyond, to walk its dusty streets and bow before its churches. The most enduring of these holy treasures was the one said to be guarded within the chapel of the tablet, the Ark of the Covenant itself, carried, so the legend claimed, from Jerusalem by Menelik I, son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Whether this was history or holy story mattered little to those who came to pray, for in their hearts the Ark was truly there, and Aksum was its chosen keeper. This sacred role gave Aksum a kind of immortality. Kingdoms could rise and fall around it. Roads could vanish into weeds, but as long as the Ark was said to rest there, Aksum could never be entirely forgotten. The coronation of Ethiopian emperors, even centuries after Aksum's political prime, still drew upon its legacy. It was here, in this city, that a new ruler's legitimacy could be anchored, not in the reach of his armies, but in the blessing of its priests and the touch of its ancient sanctity. In this era, the kingdom's identity leaned more heavily on faith than on power. The churches built in the time of Ezana and his successors remained centers of worship. The liturgy and traditions of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, shaped in part by Aksum's early Christian heritage, carried forward without interruption. The faith that had once been the kingdom's proud symbol before foreign courts was now its shield against the erosion of time. But faith alone could not halt the changes pressing in from all sides. The shifting climate, which had troubled harvests for generations, continued to test the land. Fields that had once yielded richly in the north were abandoned as farmers moved to more fertile regions. Communities that had been part of Aksum's northern trade routes either disappeared or became absorbed into new, smaller polities. The highlands grew quieter, and yet there is a quiet dignity in how Aksum endured this period. It did not vanish from the map in fire and ash, as so many ancient powers did. Instead, it chose, or perhaps was forced, to become something different. It was no longer the center of an empire, but a guardian of heritage, a custodian of faith. In the stillness of its decline, it preserved the heart of its story for the future. If you were to walk through Aksum in these days, you would still see life, not the bustle of a trading hub, but the slow rhythm of a pilgrim city. Monks would chant softly in the cool shadows of the church. Children would carry water from stone wells, their laughter mingling with the cooing of doves that nested in the old Stelae. Merchants would sell bread and honey in small markets, their goods humble, but enough to sustain those who lived there. The air would be thick with the scent of incense, rising in curls from the altars. Beyond the city, however, the political world had shifted decisively. New powers in the Ethiopian highlands began to shape the course of history, and the title of Negus, once synonymous with Aksum, passed into dynasties that ruled from other seats. The empire of old was gone, but its shadow still stretched across the centuries. every new ruler who claimed descent from Solomon and Sheba, and by extension from Aksum's own line, paid silent homage to the city that had given Ethiopia its first great age. The world might have looked away from Aksum, but in a way, that is when it began to take root in legend. Freed from the demands of governing far-flung territories, it became entirely itself, a place of memory, a keeper of sacred stories, a witness to the fact that not all power is measured in armies and coin. And yet, there is a question that lingers here, one that hums just beneath the quiet of its streets. When the world moves on, is survival enough? Or does a kingdom that has once ruled the seas still dream, somewhere in the deep recesses of its soul, of rising again? Then we step now into that final, quiet transformation. The moment when the Kingdom of Aksum, once a name spoken in the courts of Rome, Byzantium, and far-off India, slowly became a whisper told around Ethiopian hearths, a legend woven into scripture, song, and the faith of generations. By the time we enter this stage of its story, the Aksum of political power is already a memory. The kings no longer rule from its palaces. The bustling port of Adulis has long been lost to shifting trade winds and foreign hands. Caravans that once carried ivory, gold, and frankincense to the coast now follow routes that bypass its lands entirely. The Stelae still stand, but they are monuments to a past age, not symbols of present authority. And yet, and this is perhaps the greatest miracle of all, Aksum did not vanish. It remained, not as a capital, but as a sacred heart, even as the centuries rolled on and new dynasties rose and fell in the Ethiopian highlands. They looked back to Aksum as the origin of their legitimacy. No emperor, no matter how distant from its stones, could claim the Solomonic lineage without acknowledging the city where Ethiopia's first Christian kings had ruled, where their faith had taken root. This spiritual legacy kept Aksum alive in a way that no army could. The city's priests guarded not only the memory of the old kingdom, but the relics and traditions that bound Ethiopia's present to its past. At the center of this heritage was the most guarded of treasures, the Ark of the Covenant, said to reside within the chapel of the tablet beside the church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. To the faithful, this was no mere story. It was truth, passed down without interruption, giving the city an unshakable holiness. Pilgrims came from across the Highlands, walking for days or even weeks, to pray in Aksum's churches, to breathe its air, to touch its ancient stones. They came not for trade or politics, but for blessing. The city, in its stillness, became a kind of bridge, a place where the world of the living touched the world of the divine, and in the quiet of its streets, you could still feel the weight of its history. The great stelae, some weathered and broken, others still rising defiantly toward the sky, stood as guardians over the centuries. The air smelled of dust and incense, the same scents that had filled these hills when King Ezana walked among his people. In the early morning, mist would cling to the slopes, and the sun, rising slowly, would paint the carved stones in a warm gold, as though the city itself still remembered the days when its banners flew over the Red Sea. Over time, as the medieval world took shape, the memory of Aksum's empire blended more deeply into legend. Stories of its origin, the Queen of Sheba's journey to meet Solomon, the birth of their son Menelik, the bringing of the Ark to Ethiopia, became not just historical claims, but sacred narrative, binding Ethiopian identity to a divine inheritance. Whether the tales were literal truth or holy metaphor mattered little. They were the anchor of a people's soul. It is worth reflecting on how rare this is. Most ancient powers disappear entirely, their ruins buried under sand, their names forgotten except by scholars. Aksum chose another path, or perhaps was chosen for it. By becoming a holy city, it ensured that it would always be protected, always remembered, always alive in the hearts of the faithful. And yet, one can imagine the stones themselves holding deeper memories than any legend can tell. Of days when Roman envoys rode through its gates, their robes shimmering with foreign dyes, of the scent of spices unloading at Adulis, carried by winds from across the sea, of the sound of chisel against granite as Stelae rose higher and higher, marking the graves of kings. All of this still lingers, faint but unbroken, like the echo of a bell that was struck long ago, but still hums in the distance. Even now, the name of Aksum carries a strange power. It is not just a place, it is a symbol, a chapter in the long and winding story of Ethiopia. When emperors in later centuries sought to remind the world of their divine right to rule, they traced their bloodline back to this city. When pilgrims kneel in its churches today, they join a chain of devotion stretching back more than 1,500 years. And so, the kingdom's final transformation was complete. No longer an empire of armies and fleets, Aksum became an empire of memory and faith. It lived on, not through conquest, but through the way it shaped the identity of a nation. It was proof that there is more than one way for a kingdom to endure, that sometimes surrendering the sword and holding fast to the spirit is the surest path to immortality. This is where history folds into legend, where stone becomes scripture, and where the hum of ancient trade is replaced by the murmur of prayer. The Aksum that once commanded the seas had become the Aksum that commanded the soul, and perhaps, in the quiet of the highland winds, it still dreams of the days when its ships sailed under the bright sun of the Red Sea, carrying its name to every shore it touched. Then let us close our eyes and step into the final chapter of Aksum's long journey, not as chroniclers tallying battles and reigns, but as travelers who have walked its streets, breathed its air, and listened to the wind that curls around its ancient stones. The kingdom of Aksum began as scattered hilltop communities, bound together by trade, ambition, and the rich soil of the Ethiopian highlands. It rose through the skill of its merchants, the strength of its armies, and the vision of rulers who saw beyond their own valleys to the vast waters of the Red Sea. It became a bridge between worlds, African, Arabian, and beyond. Its voice heard in the markets of Alexandria, the ports of India, and perhaps even the distant courts of China. It was a kingdom of ships and stelae, of gold coins stamped with the faces of kings, of bustling ports where a dozen tongues might be heard in a single breath. Its rulers embraced Christianity when the world's great empires still debated its place, and in doing so, Aksum gave Ethiopia a faith that would endure through every shifting wind of history. And yet, like all powers, it faced the long shadow of change. The seas it once commanded turned toward new ports, the climate shifted, and the lifelines of trade frayed and broke. Adulis fell silent, its harbors filled with silt and memory. The northern highlands, once the drumbeat of the empire, grew quieter with each passing season. But here is where Aksum's story defies the usual ending. It did not vanish into ruins swallowed by grass, nor crumble into dust unmarked. It became something else entirely, a keeper of faith, a guardian of the Ark, a city where the weight of centuries could still be felt in the worn steps leading to its churches. In time, Aksum's name became as much a prayer as a place. Emperors sought its blessing, pilgrims sought its peace. Its stelae watched over the city as they had for over 1,000 years, standing silent in the sun, their carved patterns a language that spoke to the sky itself. And in the cool shadows of the church, incense rose like the breath of the past, curling into the rafters, as monks sang the same hymns their ancestors had sung when the kingdom was at its height. There is a kind of wisdom in such survival, in letting go of one kind of power to embrace another. Aksum teaches us that glory need not be loud to be eternal, that sometimes the strongest legacy is not in what is conquered, but in what is preserved, that a kingdom can live on in faith, in story, and in the identity of a people, long after its borders have faded from the map. If you were to visit Aksum today, you would not find the roar of an empire. You would find stillness, the kind of stillness that hums with memory, the kind that makes you lower your voice without knowing why. You might walk past the great obelisks, tracing their carved lines with your fingertips, feeling the cool stone, and knowing that human hands shaped them more than 1,000 years before you. You might hear the faint toll of a church bell in the morning mist, and realize that this sound has marked the hours here for generations without end. In that moment, you would understand that Aksum is not gone. It is here, alive in the stones, the air, the prayers, and the hearts of those who remember. It is a reminder that history is not just the rise and fall of power, but the quiet endurance of meaning. And so we close our journey, leaving the kingdom where it stands, not in triumph, not in defeat, but in a kind of timeless watchfulness. It has seen empires come and go, seas change their paths, and faith travel through centuries untouched. And still, It waits, holding the stories of its people like treasures in the vault of memory. Perhaps, as you drift toward sleep, you might imagine walking those streets yourself, feeling the highland breeze, hearing the murmur of distant prayers, and seeing the long shadows of the Stelae stretch toward the horizon. In the hush of that vision, you would know that Aksum's story is not over. It simply continues, quietly, patiently, like a flame that never dies. And in the silence after, you might realize something else, that somewhere in the deep pulse of the earth and the whisper of the wind, the kingdom is still speaking. All we need to do is listen.